Kalash, and this is the second part of the no input mixer tutorial. So in this part, I'm going to talk about extending the no input mixer setup into a setup where we have, like, first of all, more inputs and more mixer channels to use, and also that means that we have different layers of sounds depending on how many channels we are using. Apart from the technical issue of using more inputs and more outputs, this helps us to work out a kind of, like, also more musical or more sonic solutions to using the no input mixer setup in let's say more deep way, also in terms of as I said, like musical and sonic aspects. Okay, so let's start first with the basic ideas of extending the no input mixer setup, also using a modular system, which is not really necessary in order to like get the most of no input mixing feedback, but it has its own advantage. Of first of all, like the obvious is modularity and the possibilities to connect audio and control signals in really complex ways, which also gives us more, let's say, complex sounds and complex setup. In terms of gear, it also has the advantage of, like, let's say, using a rather more compact setup than using, for example, like an array of pedals or bigger mixers. It is like, as I said, like a really interesting way of let's say combination, let's say, of combining the modular setup with no input mixing. Also, the modular setup I'm using here is not really, let's say, complex. It's rather like very simple and very standard. I'm using EQs, filters, and mixers, which is more or less, in a way, similar to using just more than one mixer at once. So, as I said, like, it's more to illustrate the ideas rather than to just talk about modular setups and combining it with no input mixer setup. So if you don't have access to a modular setup, you just need to understand what I'm going to discuss here in terms of ideas and concepts, because that's actually what's the whole thing, the whole idea of no input mixer is about. It's not about gear, it's not about using modular setup or complicated effects or anything of that sort. It's just about understanding the idea of inputs, outputs, and rerouting and connecting the different inputs to different outputs and applying that to, let's say, creative music and sonic making. So, first of all, like this is the Multimixer with two auxins and 8 channel inputs. What I'm doing here basically is taking each one of the auxins to another mixer in the modular setup, and so if I have two auxins, they go to a mixer module with 2 inputs and 4 outputs for each channel. So one auxins gives me like I can divide that or multiply that. It depends on the kind of modules that you use. But I'm not going to discuss that in depth now. Multipliers and dividers are a bit different and they function differently, but that's not the idea now. The idea is that I take each one of the auxins and make 4 outputs for each one of the inputs, and each one of those inputs goes into a different connection in the modular setup. So I take 2 auxins multiplied by 4 outputs that already we're talking about 8 signals. I can then, like, to start from the let's say from the beginning or the least complex idea of no-input mixers, if I take 2 auxins, multiply each one by 4 outputs, then I already can use all of the 8 channels in the mixer. And sonically, musically speaking, that already means a lot. Because as you've noticed in the previous video, the first part of this tutorial, where I mentioned that the normal setup of by normal I mean the most basic setup of the no-input mixer board, where you have just one signal and one channel. The sound is more or less boring, and also due to limitations in the different kinds of mixer, there's sometimes with certain mixers it's even hard to take this single sound further. But now with 8 channels utilizing one mixer, which is the main mixer that we're using in the no-input mixer setup, and also a mixer module where in a modular system, and you already have let's say a complex sound, even if you don't use any other modules at all. So just by multiplying 2 auxins to 4 channels in the mixer, that's already a rich sound to start from. And then if we take each one of those 8 signals that we already have in the modular setup, if we take those, for example, and route them into let's say an EQ or filters and other kind of modules, which actually let's say, for example, like voltage control filters or the DC polarizer. It's not a big deal if you don't know like what all of this stuff is about, but the main idea is that if you take each one of these signals and take it to a different module, that in like in principle each module has its own audio function or control function, which can therefore change or shape the sound in one way or another. One of the most interesting models that one can use are actually, again, I want to remind you that it's not about models and modular setup. So just if you understand the idea of using specific signal processors like the specifically or particularly equalizers and filters, no matter if like within the mixer itself or as effect pedals or in a modular setup, just the basic idea of using equalizers and filters. It gives really a multitude of possibilities to shape sounds. Because not simply because they're like, let's say, interesting modules or interesting effects, but basically because, as we know in general about sound waves, like their content actually is frequencies, and once you have this kind of access to controlling the different frequencies and shape the frequency spectrum of audio information or audio signals, then you're actually controlling, let's say, the sound itself. It's like working with clay and shaping it, working with raw material and working out a kind of, like, let's say, a more or less finished project out of it. Basically, also, I'd like to think of filters and equalizers. Well, also it's interesting to know that actually equalizers are based on filters. So, like, filters are the basic components of equalizers. What I like the way that I see filters and equalizers is also, let's say, if I want to speak in really simple terms, it's like using different colors and like, let's say, if you want to visualize it, it's like touching like specific and particular details in the sound itself. A technical note on filters and equalizers, or EQs. So filters in general are exactly what they are called. They filter out specific frequency ranges, which means that they allow a specific part of the audio signal to pass through while rejecting others, depending on the filter type. And there are three most common types of filters, namely high-pass filters, low-pass filters, and band-pass filters. And they are controlled by setting specific parameters like the cutoff frequency, resonance, and passband, or the Q factor, which is specific to the band-pass filter. So low-pass filters allow the frequencies below the cutoff frequency to pass through while rejecting the others above. High-pass filters allow the frequencies above the cutoff frequency to pass through while rejecting the others below. And a band-pass filter allows a specific range of frequencies to pass through while rejecting the others below and above it, determined by what is called the Q factor, which is actually the bandwidth. The resonance in a filter is technically a boost in the frequencies close to the cutoff frequency, and depending on the filter type and design, they can create some interesting effects that could range from a sweeping effect to a kind of feedback effect. As for equalizers, they are designed to allow a direct control in the amplitude of several frequency bands and ranges, namely the low frequencies, mid frequencies, and high frequencies. And depending on the type of the EQ, it can be also everything in between. Controlling specific frequency amplitudes of an audio signal actually is one way of shaping its frequency spectrum, which can have interesting applications not limited to enhancing audio and making it sound better, but also allows for shaping the sonic content itself. One example for that, and specifically when using EQs in a no input mixer setup, is that it allows for working with the sound material in interesting ways, like shaping thick sounds which are almost chord-like, and also playing something that almost sound like single notes in a musical scale. I say almost because, as mentioned before, feedback loops and no input mixer are not always stable or predictable, but still they are really controllable in many different ways, as we can see. So now I'm going to show you a quick demonstration of using the no input mixer setup with the modular system.